What is the relation between the university and society? Is the university a place of education, a place where you search for truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that search may be? Or is it a place of socialization, even a place of activism, a place where you were taught about the injustices in society and what you can and should do to repair them? Ultimately, what's the purpose of the university? What would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson with the Austrian Economics Center and Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria, and we're going to be closing out our series on free speech in universities this week by taking a look at what Hayek has to say about the purpose of the university. So right off the bat, I'd like to suggest that two of the problems pervading universities and threatening free speech today are the desire for equality of outcome and viewing the only desirable knowledge as practice-oriented knowledge. So in other words, utilitarianism. Equality of outcome and utilitarianism. We'll explore both of these in this video. But I'd also like to say at the outset that we've been laboring under an assumption. That assumption is that academic freedom, education in general, will lead to the good of society. Now, I won't get into this philosophical debate as to what exactly constitutes the good of society, but suffice it to say that if you inhabit an intellectual universe formed by Marx or by his critical theory descendants, such as Marcuse, then academic freedom has little role to play in ensuring the good of society. And that's because on this reckoning, the good of society has less to do with the free and humble exchange of ideas and more to do with ensuring equality. Equality, a tricky word. So let's talk a little bit about this before getting back to the university and free speech. What does equality mean for many progressives today? It means stamping out pockets of privilege and power, whether they be the bourgeoisie or the patriarchy or the colonialists or the rich or what have you. It's because these pockets of privilege and power are what's preventing everybody else, particularly the groups viewed as oppressed, from having more. Presumably having more money or more prestige or more of a voice in society. So for these people, the good of society is basically equity, equality of outcome. Now, I say that the good of society for these people is equality of outcome and not equality of opportunity. The reason I say this is because equality of opportunity still leaves room for individual initiative, for individual agency. It still suggests that the onus is on the individual to work hard if he wants to catch up to others or surpass them in wealth, prestige, or power, or whatever. But the progressives do not make this argument. One, because they do not think in terms of individuals, but in terms of groups. And two, because to suggest that their oppressed groupe du jour must work hard would essentially amount to victim blaming. A disturbing implication follows from this. That is that the oppressed group cannot have agency. It must remain passive. It must remain a victim. If it were allowed a voice, ironically, if it were allowed precisely what it is that the progressives think that they are allowing it, a voice, if it were admitted that it had agency, then there's the risk that it might say things or act in ways that contradict the victim narrative that progressive intellectuals have forced upon it. In the worst case scenario, it might lift itself out of its alleged oppression, and therefore, it might cease to be a victim. So the victim narrative is inevitably connected to advocating equality of outcome. So let's bring this back now to free speech. The good of society for the progressive is equality of outcome. Speech that moves in that direction is encouraged. Speech that takes us away from that goal should be banned. Consequently, some would say that the university is more a process of socialization. The irony, of course, being that the pervasiveness of deplatforming, cancel culture, safe spaces, microaggressions, so woke education in general, that all of this has done more to increase students' and faculty's distrust and fear of one another than actually socialize them. Now, if the university is a process of socialization, then it's not so much a place for education or open inquiry. You don't need open inquiry because the goal is already fixed: equality of outcome. So the university then becomes a place of indoctrinating students to accept that goal and to discuss the most effective means of attaining it. Now, the interesting thing is that this is not the first time that institutions of higher learning, of higher education, have been established with a view to indoctrination or remaking society even. Hayek focuses his criticism mainly on the establishment of the École Polytechnique in the late 18th century in France. Its underlying spirit and history are what Hayek finds objectionable. So the École Polytechnique was created to pursue military and industrial goals. And Hayek notes that the Polytechnicians there had a definite practical bent in their teaching. Now, there's nothing wrong with an institute that wants to teach practical skills. One need only think of vocational schools, for instance. The problem, though, is when you extend this mentality to all of society. It becomes a problem when you think that the only things worth knowing are techniques and practical skills. It's a problem because you don't necessarily know what is practical or what is useful in advance. I'll give you an example from my own life. Many years ago, I decided for fun to learn Italian. Absolutely useless. Didn't really know any Italian people. I just like the sound of the language. I like the culture, that sort of thing. I went to Rome when I was 12, started reading Dante in my teens. Didn't understand much of it at all. But, I like the culture, I like the history. Why not? Now, I learned it, and then a few years after that, I ended up getting a job for a bit with some Italians. Now, I only got that job because I was able to speak the language. So it turned out that learning Italian was actually very useful for me. But if I would have brought that utilitarian mentality into selecting which language to learn, I never would have bothered learning Italian in the first place. I couldn't have known when I chose to learn the language that one day it might be useful. And Hayek actually has an interesting way of putting the matter, albeit in a somewhat different context, where he's talking about the idea of foreseeing and controlling the growth of our knowledge, of our reason. This is what he has to say. He says, "The presumptuous aspiration that reason should direct its own growth could in practice only have the effect that it would set limits to its own growth, that it would confine itself to the results which the directing individual mind can already foresee." And you see, this is the problem with the Polytechnicians. They thought they already knew everything worth knowing. They were eager then to apply their military or civil engineering studies to reality, to the rest of society. They were eager to design, and therefore they were intolerant of systems or institutions that had grown spontaneously or that would prevent them from attaining their goal. And this is why they tended to lean towards socialism. And there's no reason to assume that woke education would turn out any differently. Now, this is all assuming that equality of outcome is the woke progressives' goal of university. But what do the students themselves think? A study published last year in Higher Education Research and Development, and you'll find a link to that in the description. This study indicates that students believe the university serves three functions. One is to get them a decent job. Two is to enable them to achieve personal growth. And three, to contribute to improvement in society. In countries with, there's some variation amongst the students' answers in these countries in terms of what weighting they give to these different functions. For example, in countries with higher tuition costs, university is seen more as an investment in a promising career. Makes sense. By contrast, in countries with lower tuition costs, the students have the luxury of seeing university as a place for, more so as a place for personal growth. Now, as for the university's role in improving society, students see three dimensions to that. One is making society more enlightened, two is making it more critical and reflective, and three is in helping their country be more competitive in the world. Now, of course, the university wasn't always this way. It used to be restricted to a much smaller portion of the population. As I mentioned in a previous video in this series, university enrollment rates boomed in the latter half of the 20th century. With that comes a shift in the perceived purpose of the university. And it's encouraging to see that many students still believe the university is a place for personal growth. And that's because to admit as much is to admit that you still need to grow, that you aren't perfect just the way you are, that there's still some work for you to do, and that the onus is therefore on you to change and not on society to change. In order for you to understand how to become better, there needs to be the free exchange of ideas, free speech. By contrast, if you were already perfect, just as you are, then the university would be little more than just a place where you pay to feel comfortable and accepted. Now, you might be okay with paying for that privilege since the customer is always right, and sometimes it looks like students are increasingly becoming customers at universities. How are you supposed to teach people who are always right? Indeed, this problem is exacerbated by universities being run too much like businesses. But ultimately, the prevailing tendency to equality and democratization sits uncomfortably with the university system. And this would be a problem even if universities were not being run so much like businesses. And that's because university and education have always been highly hierarchical. The teachers, who hopefully know more than their students, determine what you'll learn. I'm going to disregard the idea promoted by some that teachers and students are equals and both learning from each other. I mean, to a very limited extent, this is indeed the case. I mean, a teacher can learn from the students how to explain a particular topic better, for example. But the subject matter itself, hopefully the teacher knows better than the student does. So to a very limited extent, it's true that students and teachers both teach one another. But it is not absolutely the case. The line must be drawn there. Because if it were absolutely the case that they're all perfect equals in the classroom, then why are students paying for the privilege of giving the teacher an education in wokeness? It's actually a brilliant scam when you think about it. Okay, so we have the constant push towards greater equality, especially equality of outcome. And then we have the problem of education becoming too utilitarian. By contrast, learning needs to be open-ended, pursued for its own sake, just as all the most beautiful things in life are. Because if it's pursued for the sake of something else, like profit or even changing society, then you will always sacrifice education to that higher goal. And that's problematic for the reason I mentioned earlier, because you don't know before you've been educated what education is going to bring you. Just like you don't know what you will discover through the free exchange of ideas, through free speech, if you don't allow it. You may even find, as I mentioned in the first video in this series, you may even find that the free exchange of ideas, the free speech, enables you to find arguments to strengthen your own position, your own convictions. Now, there are in theory studies that are pursued for their own sake, and I'd like to spend the rest of my time discussing such studies, even though they're not the only ones that are affected by Marxism, critical theory, New Left, woke education in general. Traditionally, the studies that are pursued for their own sake are the liberal arts, the humanities. They're traditionally called liberal arts because they were the studies appropriate to a free person, giving him a well-rounded education. But precisely because their purpose is nothing other than themselves, precisely because they appear so pointless, they're some of the worst offenders today when it comes to woke education. In our hyper-utilitarian society, the liberal arts just beg to have a purpose. The problem is compounded when you combine this with the tendency to reject hierarchy and for equality to permeate absolutely everything. Now, this needn't be a bad thing, mind you. Equality needn't result in a leveling down of education to the lowest common denominator, even if in practice that's what sometimes happens. Because let us recall that a liberal education was traditionally considered necessary for a well-functioning democracy, for a system based on equality. The point is well put by the 20th century philosopher Leo Strauss. I quote, "Liberal education is literate education of a certain kind, some sort of education in letters or through letters. There is no need to make a case for literacy. Every voter knows that modern democracy stands or falls by literacy. In order to understand this need, we must reflect on modern democracy. What is modern democracy? It was once said that democracy is the regime that stands or falls by virtue. A democracy is a regime in which all or most adults are men of virtue. And since virtue seems to require wisdom, a regime in which all or most adults are virtuous and wise, or the society in which all or most adults have developed their reason to a high degree, or the rational society. Democracy, in a word, is meant to be an aristocracy which has broadened into a universal aristocracy." So in its ideal form, democracy consists not of a leveling down, but of everyone pulling themselves up, everyone striving to do better. And that's not up to society or the state to ensure, which is a good thing, because if it were, it would be an impossible task. Thankfully, though, it's up to you, the individual. Democracy, in its best form, requires that individuals cultivate certain qualities such as patience, perseverance, and concentration. To quote Strauss again, "Liberal education is the counterpoison to mass culture, to the corroding effects of mass culture, to its inherent tendency to produce nothing but specialists without spirit or vision, and voluptuaries without heart. Liberal education is the ladder by which we try to ascend from mass democracy to democracy as originally meant. Liberal education is the necessary endeavor to found an aristocracy within democratic mass society. Liberal education reminds those members of a mass democracy who have ears to hear of human greatness." Liberal education consists then not of an agenda promoting instantaneous equality of outcome or a laundry list enumerating the ugly injustices that various groups have suffered. After all, humankind cannot bear so much self-blame. By contrast, liberal education consists of the patient and free exchange of ideas, the pursuit of truth, the study of the most beautiful things, of the pinnacles of human thought and achievement. Let us not forget that this is the sort of education that a great thinker like Hayek himself had received. And it was the disregard of this liberal education that Hayek considered so tragic about the École Polytechnique. Hayek says on this matter, "Thus a whole generation grew up to whom that great storehouse of social wisdom, the only form indeed in which an understanding of the social processes achieved by the greatest minds is transmitted, the great literature of all ages, was a closed book. For the first time in history, that new type appeared, which, as a product of the German Realschule and of similar institutions, was to become so important and influential in the later 19th and the 20th century. The technical specialist, who was regarded as educated because he had passed through difficult schools, but who had little or no knowledge of society, its life, growth, problems, and values, which only the study of history, literature, and languages can give. These are the things that make up a liberal education. These are the things that are conducive to freedom. And these are some of the things that are under threat in the universities and society at large by the onslaught of deplatforming, safe spaces, cancel culture, woke education in general. As Hayek would remark in another context, we are rapidly abandoning not the views merely of Cobden and Bright, of Adam Smith and Hume, or even of Locke and Milton, but one of the salient characteristics of Western civilization as it has grown from the foundations laid by Christianity and the Greeks and Romans. Not merely 19th century and 18th century liberalism, but the basic individualism inherited by us from Erasmus and Montaigne, from Cicero and Tacitus, Pericles and Thucydides, is progressively relinquished. Now, having said all this, to return to the assumption I raised but did not entirely address at the outset, the assumption that academic freedom will lead to the good of society. Well, it'll certainly allow us to reach greater heights, but also to stoop to greater depths. To cite Strauss again, we cannot expect that liberal education will lead all who benefit from it to understand their civic responsibility in the same way or to agree politically. Karl Marx, the father of communism, and Friedrich Nietzsche, the step-grandfather of fascism, were liberally educated on a level to which we cannot even hope to aspire. Free speech can permit stupid statements, but that's its very beauty. The beauty of free speech is that we do not know what conclusions it will lead us to. It's a wager on human reason and human decency, and on hope. And it's up to us as individuals to ensure that it hasn't been a foolish wager. And in any case, it is certainly preferable to the alternative, which is coercion and violence. And on that note, it's patently false to say that speech is violence. I know that's one of the things that's often said nowadays. That's false. Speech can be construed as violence only by those who are so dominated by their imagined fragility and their emotions that even if they are free in society, they are slaves in their souls. And they seek only to bring everyone else down to their level as a result. Now, such people will always exist, but their existence is not a justification to prevent others from speaking freely and setting their sights higher. For free speech, free thought, free inquiry is the only thing that allows us to pursue the true, the good, and the beautiful. It is what allows us to communicate with the greatest minds in human history. It enables the conversation between civilizations. It is what truly makes possible a community of humanity through the ages. And so I'll conclude by giving the last word to one of these many great minds, one mentioned by Hayek in the quote above, namely Tacitus, the greatest Roman historian who wrote of the early imperial age of Rome, a time of sycophancy and endless prosecutions, and in that sense actually a time not so very different from our own. So a man, Cremutius Cordus, an historian in fact, He's being prosecuted for having written a history in which he praises the long-dead Republicans Brutus and Cassius. He defends his words before the Senate before walking out and starving himself to death. After which point, Tacitus reports, the Senate ordered his books to be burnt by the aediles, but they survived, first hidden and later republished. This makes one deride the stupidity of people who believe that today's authority can destroy tomorrow's memories. On the contrary, repressions of genius increase its prestige. All that tyrannical conquerors and imitators of their brutalities achieve is their own disrepute and their victims' renown. I'm not sure if Hayek would put it in such grandiloquent terms, but like all free men and women, I'm sure he would agree.
You know what's funny about this banner here is that it doesn't matter where you move, his eyes always seem to be following you, no matter where you are in the room. You know, it's one of the most mesmerizing and also creepy things. Anyhow, everybody, thank you for checking out this video. We put a lot of work into these videos, so we hope that you're really enjoying them. If you have been, then please feel free to suggest a topic that you'd like us to deal with in a future video. We take all sorts of suggestions, and Hayek has a lot to say about all sorts of different things. And, most important of all, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends.